Good morning to everyone. I now call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment to order. My name is Ron Bonatrouche, and I am the MLA for the Dead Show and Deputy Chair of this committee. Our first order of business is to open the meeting with a prayer. I will conduct the prayer myself. Blessed Creator, we ask your blessing and guidance for good health and good thoughts for all the people of the Northwest Territories. We look to your guidance to lead us down the right path as we make decisions for the people. We ask nothing more than the simplest things that life has to offer. Blessed. Okay, once everyone is settled here, we'll have introductions. First, we'll have introductions of all the MLAs, even the ones on the phone, just so we all know who's in attendance. And then we'll have introductions of the staff that are in the room. We can start with MLAs on my left.
Mr. Chair, my name is Steve Norton, MLA for Trinidad Wilda.
Katrina Knockleby, MLA for Great Slave.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Frida Martzellos for Tabacha.
Caitlin Cleveland, MLA Cam Lake.
On the phone,
Alan Johnson, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Jackson Lafferty, member for Mophie.
Rocky Simpson, MLA River South.
Jackie Jacobson, MLA Nunavut.
and we'll start with the staff on my right.
James Thomas, Committee Clerk.
Amy Lazat, Sketty Advisor.
Michael Ball, Director of Research and Committee Advisory Services.
Let's see, members and staff. I guess our next item is the review and the adoption of the agenda. Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee has 2 items on the agenda today. We have a public briefing with Mr. Bolio and then a public briefing with the Office of the Regulator of Oil and Gas Operations. Then committee will go in camera for a wrap-up discussion.
I see, Mr. Clerk. Are there any additions or changes to the agenda? Hearing no changes, we have a motion to approve the agenda. Ms. Knockleby. All those in favor, motion is carried. Are there any declarations of conflict of interest? Here none. It'll be on an as and when basis. Today, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment is receiving public briefings from Darrell Beaulieu and the Office of the Regulator of the Oil and Gas Operations. Today's meeting is being live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels, and any presentation materials will be uploaded to the Legislative Assembly's website. I would like to remind all members and our witnesses that all comments, questions, remarks will need to be directed to myself as the chair. Both members and the witnesses will need to wait to be recognized by the chair before speaking. We'll now invite our first presenter, Mr. Beaulieu, to introduce himself and to proceed with his opening remarks, and should he have any presentations. Merci.
Mercy, Mr. Chair.
Gani Marcy Thaila Noelias Tiasi. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to come and present to the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment. And I know I was supposed to come here, I think it was October, and I hit a little speed bump and had to be away for about a month. But I wanted to provide an overview of the NWT Indigenous Leaders Coalition, and that's an initiative that's championed by Denendeh Development Corporation, and I was selected as the spokesperson for the coalition. Now, the goal of the coalition is to create a unique investment vehicles to increase Indigenous ownership, co-ownership in major infrastructure and resource projects. Today's focus is on some of the elements of the coalition's 5-year plan, and kind of lays out the coalition, how the coalition and the GNWT can work together or collaboratively to improve the economic conditions of in the smaller Indigenous communities, and of course the overall economy of the Northwest Territories. So next, who we are. The coalition includes the Inuvialuit, the Dene, the Métis, both the North Slave Métis and also the NWT Métis Nation. While each of them represent distinct and resourceful Indigenous communities, everybody still pursues their own interests, but we will come together to take on complex territorial challenges that threaten the future prosperity. And then we have a committee mandate, and I'll leave that. I know the time might be a limit, so I'll give you a chance to read that when you get a chance. And I guess the willingness to collaborate has been demonstrated over the last several years. And it really started, I think, in Fort Smith in 2014 when the Dene Nation passed a resolution directing Denendeh Development Corporation to work with all Indigenous people, governments, and industry to stimulate, natural resources, whether and corridors, and looking to export our resources to markets elsewhere. And those resources, whether they be mining, oil and gas, or forestry, or fisheries, or traditional economies, it's a broad spectrum of the amazing rich resources we have here in the Northwest Territories. So as you see on the slide, we had that 2014 meeting, and then also in 2018, the Indigenous leaders came together, and of course in December of 2 times in 2018, and then in 2019 of December. Parallel to that, the GNWT and the former government also met in October of 2018 and in October of 2019. And interestingly, and I think it encourages the people in the Northwest Territories that the really strong focus on collaboration. We're such a small jurisdiction of 30 plus communities, 40 plus thousand people, and we're smaller than the city of Red Deer in a sense. But we span 1.3 million square kilometers with, diamonds, gold, oil, gas, forestry, fresh water. We have it all here. It's just a matter of how do we maximize the use of those resources to benefit the residents of the NWT, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Who or not, because the coalition's intention is to look at large projects, but it's inclusive of everybody, right from the pan-territorial to the regional level, to the community level, and to the individual business person. It's about creating opportunity. So we're not intended to displace any development corporations or other entities. The work is not to disincentivize development aspirations, development corporations' aspirations, and we will not compete on projects with regional or other NWT Indigenous entities. And of course, we won't act as a Chamber of Commerce or a one-stop for project consultation. And then we have our guiding principles. That's quite a bit, so I'll let you read it at your leisure. Then we have the target sectors. We have transportation, infrastructure, energy, and of course social infrastructure such as housing. So the magnitude of projects is huge. And I think any one entity has its challenges getting them going, and that's part of the collaborations initiative. Is the 5-year plan identified the same strategic infrastructure investments outlined in the 19th Assembly priorities. There's the Mackenzie Valley Highway, there's the Slave Geological Province Access Corridor, and the Telston Hydro Expansion. And the GNWT had identified as the first priority the creation of the NWT Venture Capital Fund to encourage investment in the NWT as part of the last discussion of the 18th Assembly. And to enable co-ownership in target sectors identified by coalition members, Indigenous corporations, and of course the businesses need to access significant amounts of capital. The creation of that investment fund would help level the playing field, and also the fund would be intended to attract partnership, private investment, private equity via its critical mass that it would create. So, and that can be mobilized for major projects. So we've had discussions with ITI on the creation of an investment fund. It was a concept, and now the discussion needs to ramp up over time here. So there is the proposed governance and administration, and Indigenous co-ownership and large-scale infrastructure and resource developments will help investor confidence, and that's one of the objectives of the coalition for these large-scale projects. The coalition, through its investor committee and due diligence, continues to look for projects for collaboration, and when projects are identified, selected Southern investors will be invited to an investor conference sometimes in 2021. And the coalition has been invited to work with ITI on doing an investor conference. And we had a 5-year timeline, and I'll get into it a little bit later, but that's kind of delayed. So it kind of threw a monkey wrench into our plans there. In terms of go-forward funding, we had submitted a plan, and the GNWT has committed $50,000 so far for 2020-21 funding, and we'd like to thank the Government of Northwest Territories for that. We had a proposal, continues to go through the process with CanNor, and I think the process has slowed down a little bit. So it's been delayed due to demands placed, because of COVID. So hopefully that'll continue down the road. I think the original 5-year budget was $3.9 million over 5 years. So we submitted to CanNor, to INAC, and to the GNWT. It looks like that we managed to garner about $250,000 with the GNWT's $50,000. So moving along, but I just wanted to talk about some of the examples where the coalition may monetize the GNWT in establishing the collaborative partnerships. And I think, everybody's aware that whether it's the federal government or provincial or territorial governments, everybody's got fiscal challenges. And then the GNWT just recently raised its debt ceiling, I think, to 1.8. But with the COVID challenges, we may reach that debt ceiling a little bit quicker than what we normally would. It could be made worse by the demands of COVID or placed on it from COVID. So there's considerations to think about. I know it's been talked about many years over in terms of government also has assets in communities and regions, and maybe it's a different way we can start looking at, based on the due diligence and whether it's feasible to transfer some of these assets, merge some of these assets, or sell some of these assets. Each initiative would have to be looked at. It could be to the communities, to the regions, or a pan-territorial if it's large enough. So those are considerations that can be looked at. Facilities and services. One of the things we looked at was fuel and fuel delivery systems. I know some of the challenges in procurement is looking at the capacity of communities and their development corporations or the businesses in the NWT. And some of the contracts that do go out to southern companies based on lack of capacity in the NWT. So I think that's going to be a huge focus that we have to work on in the next several years here. So, a sharing mechanism, if greater than the target is achieved, we can incentivize performance, above those targets. We can look at the sliding scale to further reductions required at certain times of the contracts. Renewables would be competitively tendered and renewed opportunity for the incumbent. And there's models out there that's been done, like the North Warning System. That these are large And Denendeh Development Corporation, along with Pan-Arctic Inuit Logistics for many years, did work on a North Warning system. And so the potential for large infrastructure and maintenance and management of these facilities is there here in the NWT, including remediation. In terms of electrical services, I think one of the challenges in the north is the cost of electricity. So I think this is a key element in terms of looking the collaboration of how can we bring the cost of electricity down. Do we need to look at bringing new technology or new investment? And majority of you know that Northland Utilities is owned 14% by the Denendeh Investments, and you may be aware that we've been working to increase that ownership to 50%. And there are other steps that we're certainly looking at in Indigenous ownership of electricity and assets in the whole territory. And I believe the Inuvialuit are working on their gas generation, which could, probably heat homes and provide electricity in that region and maybe elsewhere. But that's something that we all have to work on and be diligent and really focused on doing here in the next few years. There are, policy challenges and policy that can support Indigenous business, and ITI has been working, and the GNWT has been working on creating a new procurement policy, an Indigenous procurement policy. So I think that's a positive step moving forward in looking at how we can strengthen and increase our workforce here in the NWT, employment, business opportunities. I know there's a lot of statistics out there, and I think moving forward, we have to be able to measure our progress. So the foundation and the policy and the regulations that come along with that have to be clear, and they have to be developed in terms of moving that needle, I guess, in the right direction here in the NWT, and keeping those dollars, those investment dollars and operational dollars here in our communities, our regions, and the territory. So, and I've always said that the role of government is to establish legislation, policies, and procedures to create an environment that's conducive to business and development of individual, regional, or community, regional, and territorial economy. And so we need to ensure that measures that can be taken in the near future include services, supplies that the GNWT provides internally and externally, and the creation of that Indigenous procurement policy that I mentioned earlier, and providing support. I think one of the asks here is asking the support of the GNWT to support the coalition efforts. And I think that the key element here is, as I mentioned earlier, we are aligned in trying to stimulate the economy of the NWT, which leads to, the intention is to lead to community wellness and social wellness of our communities. So it's an invitation to make a bold transformation and reinvent our supporting business development, Indigenous business development, growth, and of course sustainability for benefits of all our residents in the NWT. With that, thank you, and if you have any questions or clarity, I'll do my best.
Merci, Mr. Beaulieu. I guess your presentation has piqued a big interest this morning, early in the morning. You have 6 people in attendance and 3 on call, the most we've ever had at a committee. With that, I'll open the floor to questions or comments from committee. Ms. Knockleby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for coming today, Daryl. I know we've had lots of conversations about this over the last year, so I'm excited for it. I firmly believe that we're only as strong as our weakest community, and I'd like to see more empowerment of the communities and Indigenous businesses, so this all lines up really well with that. I had a question for you about how you envision the investment fund to carry forward. At this point, I'm assuming that you'd be looking for some GNWT supports to get it going, but is there a mechanism or a way you see of the fund becoming self-sustainable in the sense of like people that are helped by the fund or projects then paying back into the fund so that the fund can then start helping more people and not be reliant every year on funding from us? Thank you.
I see Ms. Knockleby. Mr. Beaulieu.
Thank you very much, Ms. Knockleby. Yes, the idea of an Indigenous fund is not new. There are funds out there. It's not specifically Indigenous, but very similar. And recently, the Alberta government created the Indigenous Opportunities Fund, and I know in Alaska you have IDEA, and in discussions with the federal government and very preliminary discussions with the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and the whole idea is to stimulate some funds. And the intent, I guess, is to create that fund. It would be probably need not the government dollars, but some guarantee of some sort, and the federal government partnership, and the fund would leverage private equity, and there's a possibility of matching dollars from the private sector, whether it be pension funds or other funds of that nature.
I see Mr. Beaulieu. Ms. Knockleby.
Thank you for that. I just wanted more of a comment. I really like the idea or the comments around looking for those holes or what's not being filled by northern businesses and then building the capacity. The capacity piece, I think, is really key. So I guess there is a question here. Is there a part of your corporation or your group that would be looking to do some sort of like business skills training, mentorship along that kind of avenue, or you would be mostly focused on business?
Mr. Beaulieu.
Thank you. There's been a lot of discussion in terms of capacity, and when you look around on training, on mentorship, etc., you want to be able to look at who's doing what, and then finding the gaps there. You have a BDIC that does some work. You got Aurora College that does some training, and various organizations like the chambers that do some work. So the coalition intent was to look at saying, what are the opportunities there? How can we work? And then I think eventually you would want to partner with some of these training organizations to be able to bring people on board in terms of whether it's financial management or just to give you an idea, the coalition is represented by just about every community in Northwest Territories, and then we do have an investment committee that's we have the Inuvialuit, we have the Dene, and the Métis with 2 people on each. And we looked at the capacity there in terms of, for example, Ernie Daniels, who's the CEO of the First Nations Financial Authority, is one of the members. So that brings a certain expertise and knowledge to the investor committee. I think we have Paul Gruner from Deron Cho, who's the CEO, who's I think he's an accountant, and we have Mark Fleming from the Inuvialuit, who's also an accountant. He's a chief operating officer. And we have a representative from the Métis and other Denic and the Inuvialuit, such as Patrick Rubin. So, and we will use expertise on the due diligence on a case-by-case basis on each of the projects, whether they're a large project or a smaller project or a collaboration project that's, again, community, regional or territorial.
I see Mr. Bolio. Any other questions from committee members? I'm not sure if I saw his hand up, but Mr. Simpson, you got any questions? If not at this time, we'll go with Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for presenting today, Daryl. Really excited about a lot of the work you're doing. Can you just speak a little further about the project, the hotel project, and it's listed as 30 million? I'm not familiar with that, so if you could provide some details, that'd be appreciated. Thank you.
I see Mr. Johnson, Mr. Bolio.
Yes, that was a discussion back in 2019 at the Indigenous Leaders Coalition that we had here in Yellowknife. So part of that, and you'll remember in 2019, tourism was generating over $200 million a year in the territory. We live in a different world today due to COVID. But yes, the intent for many years was for the Indigenous community start getting involved in accommodation sector, the tourism sector, and so some of those identified, whether they're large infrastructure projects or else in the service sector and the hotels, those were kind of target numbers that they were looking at. It gave you an idea of the type of and the scale of the projects that the Indigenous leaders were looking at. At the same time, keeping in mind that, as I said, who we are not, we're not out there to compete, and if a region or a community wanted to do this on their own, the coalition would be very supportive, and supportive in terms of is there capacity that we can provide, or is there financial support that we can provide, etc. So the partnerships in various forms can be looked at. So in Yellowknife, of course, you're going to be hotels. I can't imagine what they've cost. Probably 20, 30, 40 million. Now it depends on the size and the market that you're focusing on. But in the communities, and if you're looking at anywhere from a few rooms to 20 or 30 rooms, the cost of construction, as we all know, in the last year is just doubled or tripled. So that 30 million, when we were talking about in 2019, is probably 50 to 60 by now. But the scale of the projects will vary.
I see Mr. Bolio. Follow up, Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, thank you. And I guess the other area that I see a lot of exciting opportunity is in the GNWT's real estate portfolio and in the leasing. I think GNWT is the anchor tenant in about 5 Northview towers in town. And I see no reason why we shouldn't, over the next decade or two, be phasing out those leases of, a multi-billion-dollar company and getting some of our Indigenous development corporations into that. And also, then they are not hiring local maintenance contracts. And I know this has been a successful model in a number of communities where, the First Nation builds the building and then GNWT leases a part of it. That helps with cover O&M. Can you just give me a sense of some examples of where the maintenance part of buildings has been contracted out by the GNWT? Have we started doing that anywhere? I see in your slide that, this has potential 20% cost savings. So it seems if we can start contracting out building maintenance, we should. But any examples of where that's occurring now would be appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I see Mr. Johnson. Mr. Bolio?
Sorry. There are some small companies that do building maintenance here in the north. In the smaller communities, I think some of the local people do the maintenance. But I don't think it's been done in any concerted effort. And some of the larger buildings here, when we looked at it, you look at the cost of those buildings and the replacements and then the operation of them. And then you looked at the ownership, which could be Southern REITs, and the ownership, which could be Northern Indigenous Coalition members. What's the difference? The difference is that the dollars would stay in the north. And the additional benefits of that, we have Aurora College here, and I think we have existing people that maintain and operate these buildings. And it can be, you'll need plumbers, you'll need electricians, you need carpenters, painters, building maintenance. If you look at a building maintenance schedule over the life of the building, the benefits of that multiplies year over year over year. And it creates a job, and it maintains a job here in the Northwest Territories for a resident.
I see Mr. Bolio. Any follow-up, Mr. Johnson?
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think the GNWT needs to take a hard look at all of its real estate portfolio and how we can divest some of it and keep that money in the north. Thank you, Dale.
All right. I see Mr. Johnson. Any further questions? Ms. Marcellos?
So Daryl, Mr. Chair, it's exciting to know that we finally had someone from the Indigenous community, a leader in the Indigenous community, on actual economic coalition and economic growth. I think it's an exciting time that we're living in, even though we have a pandemic, and maybe it made us open our eyes a little bit. I think that ownership by our own people is extremely important, and I want to thank Mr. Bolio for coming this morning to give his presentation. And some of his presentations are very broad, but I know that the potential is there for growth. And he mentioned a couple of people that are extremely important in that growth, and one of them is the whole thing with the financial prospects of the Indigenous group out of Kelowna, which is Ernie Daniels. He's a key player in this whole thing, and I think there's a lot of potential there with very little dollars being put in, and when you get monies from there, it's only at 2%. And I think a lot of our own business people in the north have not taken advantage of that because they don't understand the concepts of all that. And it's nice that we're going to have a group that's going to be explaining and doing all these things to put it together to ensure the people of the North keep the dollars here. And I've worked with Daryl for many years within the First Nation, and the groups that are involved here and the groups that could be involved is extremely positive. I guess the one question I wanted to ask Daryl was, you belong to the Business Advisory Council. Do you feel like how many people that are Indigenous that sit on that Business Advisory Council?
Let's see, Ms. Marcellos, Mr. Bolio.
Thank you. I was going to say Chief Marcellos. Frida. Currently, I'm the only Indigenous person on the Business Advisory Council. There are Indigenous organizations represented, but they do have non-Indigenous employees that are on the advisory council there, including with the chambers and the various organizations such as engineers and the Chamber of Mines, etc. You mentioned the importance of the First Nations Financial Authority and the expertise they bring, because they find financial, they get financing and they get good rates for their financing. And it's important to link that, because the NWT, the population of the NWT is majority Indigenous, and the intent, again, with the coalition is to develop the economy. And if we look at like-minded organizations, one I'd like to mention is the First Nations Major Project Coalition, who we're involved in with. And it's interesting because that coalition gets funded by over $2.5 million, and other projects or things that they're doing. Just recently, I think they got about another 1.5, and that's to stimulate large major infrastructure projects that Indigenous people will be involved in. And their membership is now well over 100, and it goes right across Canada. And a lot of major businesses, corporations are involved with that. It's federally funded. BC is involved with that. And then you have First Cooperatives in Saskatchewan, which is another type of coalition that Indigenous people have created. You have the Inuit coalition across northern Canada, and they just created the International Inuit Coalition to look at investment. So, and Ontario has been doing that now, and a lot of the focus in Ontario has been on electrical energy generation, transmission, and each province, if you look at it, has stimulated Indigenous equity and participation in the infrastructure and the ownership of the transmission and the related delivery of electrical energy. So it's happening right across the country. So and a lot of those jurisdictions have the financial support and the capacity linked to that to start making this happen. So I think it's important that we start looking at this seriously in the North. And again, it's to the benefit of the North, the Indigenous people, and of course Canada, right?
Merci, Mr. Bolio. Follow up, Ms. Marcellos.
Mr. Chair, I think it's extremely important that we start really seriously as a group within these, with ordinary MLAs and with cabinet, start ensuring that we start supporting NWT Indigenous leaders in business. I think that's the only way we're going to be able to come to an agreement on a lot of these large projects. That's the only way that our people are going to be involved, and it's the only way that we're going to have control. And I think, as a great supporter of business throughout my life, I feel that it's one thing that could stimulate the economy and make sure that we come back and bounce back after this pandemic. And I think that the Indigenous people have a way of putting it together and making it work. And it's wonderful to see that we have an Indigenous speaker here today, and I'm very grateful for that with this committee. And Daryl, I want to thank you for coming in today. I think that it's a positive thing, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Ms. Marcellos. I see that as more as a comment, but if I'll give you a chance to answer if you'd like, Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think, and I agree with MLA Frida Marcellos, that it's important that we have more of these sessions, and partly, it's part of educating and informing the GNWT. Partly, it's a learning process on our side also. To continue that engagement, because as we move along, things change on a daily, weekly, monthly, and an annual basis. But very, very important, I think, collaboratively with the Indigenous people, with the NWT and the government and industry, very, very important. We have to set the tone for business and governance and what the people of the NWT see in creating a healthy and social lifestyle in their communities. And that message, I think, collaboratively, as I said, with industry, Indigenous people, and the GNWT, has to be related to the federal government, because whether we like it or not, the federal government does have a huge influence on the fiscal and the governance of our territory as things are changing in terms of the recent GNWT agreements with the Indigenous people on moving forward. Thank you.
Merci, Mr. Bolio. Next I have Ms. Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Mr. Bolio as well for joining us here today. I'm very happy to see you here, and I was especially happy to see you mention that one of your 3 target sectors in your presentation is housing. We live in a territory that has a huge housing challenge ahead of them. And we're at an interesting crossroad where, yes, we have a huge housing challenge, but we have huge housing opportunities as well. The federal government is very interested in giving out money for housing at the moment. And we also have a lot of programs within the GNWT that also pair quite nicely for programming that supports housing. But one of the problems that I'm seeing, or challenges that I'm seeing, is getting the money from the buckets that it sits in within all the different government departments or levels of government, and actually putting it into houses that people can sleep in and people can live in. And I see that housing is as much of a social envelope piece as it is an exciting economic piece as well. And so I guess my big question here is, does the Economic Coalition, or do you see the Economic Coalition kind of bringing together all of these pieces and helping communities actually bring the supports and the finances together in order to help communities get the housing that they want to see in their communities? Thank you.
Merci, Ms. Cleveland. Mr. Bolio?
Okay, thank you very much, MLA Cleveland. I think that's a real challenge that we've been having in the North for a long time, is housing. We've looked at it, and you have communities that are doing housing strategies and looking at developing housing for the communities. There's a whole plethora of challenges, such as land, developed land, infrastructure, whether it's electrical. But that one big challenge is the criteria, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of dollars out there. And some of the criteria to getting those dollars is very, very challenging, because, each has its own different process of acquiring that. And it's very similar to, I just want to liken it to remediation. It's like the federal government putting remediation contracts out. I don't think any NWT company has got a large remediation contract. All the contracts go to southern and international firms. So one of the recommendations that we had was, why don't we create a Northern Indigenous public works that involves the people of the North. Instead of INAC giving those contracts to DPW Canada, transfer that authority here to the North, and then we could RFP to Northern and Indigenous business. And I think that's a similar model could be done for housing, because everybody is getting all these different housing, albeit we're all in different situations, because some of the land claimant agreements call for that, so they'll do their own housing. But then there's still a huge population in NWT that's not there, right? And we need to develop a model, because there's too many out there, and everybody's so confused and saying, okay, I need to go to Ottawa, I need to go to Housing Corporation, or I need to go through this other program that NRC has, or Natural Resources Canada, that includes a new heating innovation, or etc. So it's got to be there's a model that's got to be developed, I think, for the North specifically. And we're all different. A house in Alahuktuk is going to be different than a house in Deta or in Trout Lake. Our environments, we span 1.3 million square kilometers, so we got different environments just in the Northwest Territories. And the cost difference of a house in Alahuktuk is totally different than a house in Fort Smith, right? Fort Smith house could be 300,000, 400,000. That same house could be, including transportation, and 18-month lead times, could cost you close to $1 million.
Merci, Mr. Bolio. Follow up, Ms. Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. No, and I'm very happy to hear that, and I think that there's huge potential in the Northwest Territories for Indigenous-owned housing, and there's built-in clientele, and that clientele isn't going anywhere. And I think there's a really huge opportunity for private and public housing to come together and create some really nice housing communities in every community. I'm very interested in the slide in regards to electric service in the NWT and potentially creating a P3 entity or bringing together a kind of a northern-owned energy sector. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit with a focus on the cost of living to Northerners. That's something that I heard quite a bit, or that I do hear quite a bit from residents in my area, as specific to energy in the Northwest Territories. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit. Thank you.
I see, Ms. Cleveland. That's a good question. Mr. Bolio?
Yeah, and as we all know, the cost of electricity in the north, in our communities, even though we're subsidized, is still quite high. And we have, two or hydro generating stations, and the majority of our communities are still on diesel. Some, are looking at biofuels, and so, and the whole electrical sector, I guess you have a couple of major utilities, NTPC, and you have Northland Utilities. Then you have the Public Utilities Board that oversees and sets the rates for the cost of electricity in the NWT. And those rates consider, the cost of generation, they consider the cost of distribution, they consider the cost of billing services, the infrastructure that's required to deliver the electricity to our communities and to our homes. And so if you start looking at the cost, I think, like any business, you start identifying where are we duplicating costs. If you look at the utilities here, you have two major utilities that have two separate billing services. You have two utilities that probably have 4 or 5 offices. And there's a number of items that can be identified saying, okay, can we look at collaborating and some sort of partnership, or else looking at one utility focusing on a certain component of the electrical pipeline, or looking at our distribution or just generation, and maybe we can use one billing, or do a merge, or some sort of partnership that'll identify those cost-saving measures. So that's going to be very important moving down the road, because our population is kind of stagnant right now. The economy, with the diamond mines slowing down, there's going to be, what is there now, about 800 people in the north that live and work in the north, that work at the diamond mines. That's going to be 800 people less that's going to have an income that'll be burdened with electrical bills, heating bills, and other bills, etc. So we really have to start looking at saying, okay, how can we bring our costs down? It'll be great if the population increases. We have, more jobs and more industry and more infrastructure built to utilize up the power and get some critical mass, but that isn't happening now, and it probably won't happen for a number of years. So not only are we thinking of the next few years, but we got to be thinking 5, 10, 20 years down the road, because it takes time to develop these processes and models.
I see, Mr. Bolio. Any further questions, Ms. Cleveland? Anybody on the line? Mr. Simpson, are you on the line?
Yeah, I am, Mr. Chair.
Do you have any questions? Or
Yeah, I guess question, comment, I guess. One of the things, first of all, I'd like to thank Daryl for the presentation, and it's good to see an Aboriginal person in front of us talking about the economy and businesses. And, something that's dear to my heart. And one of the issues that we continually hear and deal with, and I think Daryl mentioned it, and that is keeping the money, keeping the work in the north, and keeping the trying to keep as much money in the north as we can. So I'm just wondering, how do you foresee, I guess, this happening? Because we've been talking about this, since I got elected, but long before that, and we seem to continue to run into roadblocks where this government, and not only this government, but some Aboriginal governments as well, and businesses that still want to run south and partner and send the money into southern Canada. So how do you think that this coalition will help, I guess, slow that bleeding of funds out of the territories and be able to keep it here? Thank you.
I see Mr. Simpson, Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Rocky. The development corporations, and we all remember that 30 years ago there was a handful. We had maybe 5 or 10, and the market was very small. There was no participation in the resource sector or in many other sectors for that matter. And what happened is, as you mentioned, there was especially when the diamond mines came, there became a lot of partnerships, southern partnerships. In some communities, there was maybe 5, 10, 20 joint ventures. And were all those joint ventures beneficial? Well, that's up to the individual partners, the Indigenous partners, to make that, so if you look at the 20 years that we've been in business, and was that enough to develop some of that capacity and transfer some of that knowledge? And then you look at a different level where the Inuvialuit are involved in the airline industry, they're involved in housing, modular housing, and other services. You look at the Tlicho, who've got involved in many sectors also, and Dedon Show and Dennis Othlini Corporation and the various development corporations in the community like Fort Smith, it's in real estate, and Katlodici in forestry. So you look at all the regions and the communities, and you start realizing that, look, there's some specific target areas they've developed capacity in. Maybe in the north, where you have a limited market, you can only develop the capacity so far. And maybe it's time. And I'd like to share a story with you, because Denendeh Investments since 1982 has been involved in the oil and gas industry. We started in Norman Wells with a drill and a service rig. Sadly, we had to sell everything off a couple of years ago due to the whole market conditions. But for about 20 years, we generated all our revenue from Alberta and British Columbia. Very little. So this capacity started here and moved into other markets. And that's the potential for northern business, because we got to realize our market. I did bring up the CEO of CRE from Alaska about 10 years ago, and the Alaska Native corporations generate, each of them, probably $1 billion to $2 billion a year in revenue. But you know what? A majority of the revenue comes from the lower 48. I asked, why are you investing in California and Texas and New York and Massachusetts? The answer was, the Alaskan market is too small. There's only 600,000 people in Alaska. There's 360 million people in the lower 48. So where there's people, there's money, right? So we got to look at ourselves that way and say, okay, how can we leverage what we have here and then start maximizing it out and bring in that investment, attract the investment to the north, or else start working with other northern remote communities in Canada that are in the same situation as us and start looking at the critical mass from that perspective.
Merci, Mr. Beaulieu. Any follow-up, Mr. Simpson?
Just one quick one. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick comment, I guess, is that, it's interesting to hear what happened with the drilling company that you guys had and the downturn in the economy, the oil and gas economy, because I got stung by that as well. So, it's one of those things as, and probably for about 10 or 15 years, I was in the same boat. I was generating about 90% of my income from Alberta as well and bringing it into the territories and spending it here. So, that's I encourage people to and businesses to do that, I guess, when possible, because it's nice to bring in fresh money that way, and it also provides some capacity building as well. So, there's a lot of ways to do it. I guess I understand. We've only got 40-some thousand people here. We've got infrastructure spread all over. We wonder why power is so high. Well, when you got 30-some communities, that's why. So there's a lot of issues, and it's not going to be solved overnight. But I think from an Indigenous perspective, I think it's good that we get together and we try to take ownership and some control of some of the things that we can do and that we can do good. So, and thank you for the presentation.
Merci, Mr. Simpson. Mr. Beaulieu, I'll give you a chance to reply to those comments if you'd like.
Thank you. I think in terms to Rocky's question, when he asked and mentioned the partnerships, a lot of it went with the South. I think that's one of the steps we have to bring home is start partnering. And I forgot to mention it, is start partnering with each other. Because as I mentioned, we do have developed some capacities here in the north. So that partnership, and even if we don't have the capacity, I think we got to realize that you can still have a 100% northern business, whether it's northern and Indigenous or just Indigenous. But you can hire the expertise just like any major, corporation. A lot of these big mining companies aren't mining companies, that they basically manage the financials of a project, and they hire the expertise to do the actual mining. So that's a model that's been created over and over and over again throughout the world. And I just wanted to mention that I think one mining company, I think it was De Beers, how, we've always looked at the 51-49 joint venture partnership. And De Beers has moved a little further than that. They started getting more benefits to Indigenous businesses that are 60-40, 70 or 80-20, and stimulating Indigenous business with more ownership. The more ownership they have, the better opportunity that they can get. I think it's a model that we can start looking at not only in the private and the industry sector, but in the public sector.
Merci, Mr. Beaulieu. Next I have Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Daryl, for coming here this morning. The three target sectors that you identified on one of the slides, I think it was slide 7, I think there's maybe a couple of other areas that you might think about as well, and you've mentioned one of them, which is environmental remediation. The federal government has given the Western provinces $1.72 billion to do some remediation work on abandoned oil and gas wells. And I keep hammering away at my colleagues just down the hall here about how the Northwest Territories needs to go to Ottawa with the Yukon and Nunavut and the Indigenous governments as well to say, we need our fair share of that. And we may not have a lot of abandoned oil and gas sites here, but certainly there's other kinds of, there's lots of mining sites that are going to need a lot of work, and Giant Mine just being down the road, and YKDFN, really pushing now for set-asides on the federal contracting there. That's really good to see. There's like $12.375 billion worth of remediation just in the federal contaminated sites alone. That work it needs to be done over, decades. And, with Aurora College being transformed into Polytech, I think there's some opportunities for some partnerships there in terms of training and apprenticeships and stuff. Anyways, I think we're starting to see the remediation economy starting to emerge, and I think there's some great opportunities there. So I just want to mention that, and if happy to pass some of that information along with you, but I'm really after my colleagues down the hall here in Cabinet to go to Ottawa to get some of this money for us in the Northwest Territories. I guess the other area that I think is really important, we heard a lot about this yesterday, our committee, was the need for affordable and accessible internet and telecommunications across the Northwest Territories. And Catlow Tech, we heard yesterday from Lyle Fabian, he's got some great ideas about how to do this, some networking just even within smaller communities here that Northwest Hell's never going to get to these communities. So, but with the satellite facilities now in Inuvik, and Catalotech is interested in data centers being located here, the same sort of things that have already been done in places like Sweden and Svalbard and so on. So I think there's a couple of other areas that I'm hoping that you guys would look at, and I think that there's a real receptiveness on the part of the federal government in terms of reconciliation and economic diversification to get into those areas. And I'm going to keep pushing my friends down the hall here on some of this, but I think some pushing from you folks as a coalition would be really helpful as well. But thanks, Mr. Chair.
I see Mr. O'Reilly. There were a lot of good comments made in there. I'll give Mr. Bolio a chance to reply if he'd like.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. And it's, I'm glad you mentioned it because one of the recommendations that we've talked about for many years is for the North, the economy, and for business and employment, that we should be prioritizing, maybe a couple of priorities, and with the Indigenous industry and the government, and really pushing the federal government in terms of saying this is what we want. Yes, over the years, I remember we used to have what they called the NWT days, where everybody went to Ottawa, and we met with just a plethora of bureaucrats and a couple of ministers, and then we came back, and there may have been some follow-up, there may have been some successes, but I would think a majority of what we wanted never came to reality. So we really have to be focused, and we got to be singing off that same song sheet. In environmental remediation, yes, the opportunity. I know that the federal government budgeted $2 billion, a little over $2 billion for the North in this last year's budget, but that goes. Probably shared with the Yukon on the Faro project and on the Giant Mine project. And as you're well aware, Denendeh Investments owns the Silver Bear Mine project up in Great Bear Lake, and that's been one of the projects that's been identified for remediation. You have Kantong, and I used to sit on the what's the name of it? Contaminated, the federal, it was a working group that looked at all contaminated sites across the country. In the north, there was 3,000. But not large ones like Giant or Canton. There's a lot of them like just barrels and old camps, etc. But the potential for remediation business is there. But again, the challenges are northern and indigenous businesses, even with partnerships from the south, is getting that work is a real challenge, and that's why I suggested that we create our own northern indigenous public works, so INEC can transfer the authority of that work to be done in the north, for the north, and by the north. We even tried the procurement strategy for Aboriginal business. That doesn't work in the north. It doesn't apply, in a matter of fact. We actually got a letter from the federal government that said it doesn't apply. And when we complained, they created a program, said, okay, well, for Indigenous business, you can get up to $2 million worth of work. Well, in the north and in that sector, that's a drop in a bucket. It doesn't even create a couple of jobs, sustainably for a couple of years, where you have remediation projects that's going to last for decades. So that's the background to that. But I think we really have to work on that together. In terms of communication and affordable internet, we've been involved with that for a number of years, and that's one of the major infrastructure that we need in the north, besides transportation and electricity, is communication. Those are the basic infrastructure that every jurisdiction needs and requires. We've been working on some of that. We've been researching some of that in the north. And with Falcon Communications a number of years ago, we did work with SSI and Northwest Tel. We put internet into every community in Northwest Territories, albeit it wasn't at the greatest speeds, but it was something that was there that people didn't have. Now we took a lot of communities off satellite and on microwave, and now that when the NWT built the fiber line, I think there's some plans moving ahead to start connecting the communities, fiber to the home, and then you have the advent of low Earth orbiting satellites, and that's Elon Musk, and I think Stat Canada now have low Earth orbiting satellites that satellite communities can access. I don't know the mechanics of that yet, but we're looking to find that out. But that's been a challenge, because the affordability of infrastructure is everybody's challenge, and of course it's a regulated industry, so CRTC is obviously involved. So they'd have to be part of this whole development. Data centers is an interesting one, because I went with former Premier Bob McLeod to Iceland, and I had a day, so I met with the communications people in Iceland, and because Iceland is one of the centers where they have data centers. Now, the economics of a data center could be very challenging, because one of the main cost factors of a data center is electricity. Now, the successful data centers get electricity for 1-2 cents a kilowatt hour. Our cost for electricity here is subsidized at a little over 30 cents, and then there's the commercial rates, etc. So, but the other good factor for data centers is our cold weather. And now data centers produce so much heat, they can heat a district or housing complex or office complex. So there's different benefits, but then there's other factors that's involved. Now we're talking about the big data centers. In Yellowknife, you actually have a data center here. The NWT has a data center across from McDonald's, and Northwest Tel has a data center for its communications. So it's not like hasn't been data centers anywhere. Now we just got to look at the scale of those data centers. And recently there's been some studies into small data centers versus the large data centers, and what's the benefits of them to a certain geography or a certain size of community. So I think that's definitely something to look at further in the north, because a lot of businesses, and we're looking at cloud-based accounting now, so that's going to be using data centers. So I'm sure businesses could benefit from that also.
You must see, Mr. Beaulieu, we've got time for one more question. Mr. Norn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tia, Senia, Johnita, Johnny, Daryl, what I just said there, I said happy for that Daryl's here with us in our language. I was madly scribbling notes here. This is something that's like near and dear, I think, to many of us, many of my colleagues. And I was looking at some of the slides, and you mentioned something about Northland's hoping to get 50%. I was hoping you'd say 51%. But, through all of this, when we're navigating through this, I've been preaching, I've been really watching, like scrutinizing all the money. I said, I've been saying from day one, all the money should stay in the north. Like we should, wherever we can. I'm a realist too. I know that sometimes we're going to have to go outside of the territory for certain services, but I think the majority of our projects, we have the people here and the business minds and the capacity to do it. I think it's just a matter of, again, like you mentioned, we should get all the same page, read sing from the same songbook, and I totally agree. And through all that, I've been hearing a lot of comments, from the businesses in our writing, and we're still, like everybody's hurting right now through the pandemic we're going through, and we're still seeing some barriers, and it drives me nuts when we get the rejection letters, and how I have to sit down with my constituents and help them, try to get the experts to help them get them the funding that they need to keep their businesses afloat, because I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that every business in my writing, for sure, and I'm sure that my colleagues feel the same way, is to keep them afloat through all this. And then again, like I said, I'm happy that you're here, because I myself, really lean on your expertise. I consider you a mentor, and if I have any sort of advice, I'll go to you for these type of questions. So, but one question I did have was with CanNor and ITI funding. Have you found some of your the businesses that you've dealt with? Have you seen some what type of barriers have you seen that they've met with ITI and CanNor?
Must see, Mr. Norn. Mr. Beaulieu?
I think that there would be some of the normal barriers that you would have even outside of a pandemic, but the pandemic has really made things much more challenging. Probably because the departments, whether it's CanNor or ITI, they weren't designed to deal with the COVID on top of the other challenges they had. But at the same time, I think we've been in this COVID here for 8 years. I mean, not 8 years, 8 months. That's a little long. Feels like 8 years. But it gives us, I think it gives everybody a chance, whether in your private sector or in the public sector, that you're learning to adapt. And as people around the world, and especially Indigenous people in the North, we've had to learn to adapt to survive. And I think that's what we need to do and keep focusing and doing that in the right way. Yes, there will always be challenges, and are we getting the funding or the resources out fast enough? And I can tell you everybody would say no. And I've never heard a news release saying that, boy, these departments got their funds out way before they needed them. But in terms of electricity and the development and looking at the challenges there needs to be a more continual conversation, because I've been involved with Northland Utilities and the electrical business, starting in 95, 96, and till today. So over the years, you've got a chance to have conversations with this private sector and the governments. And I know there's been proposals to the GNWT, probably 3 or 4 now, in looking at how we could work together. And I think that conversation needs to continue. Yes, there might be other challenges on the side tables, etc., but those things will work itself out. We just need to say, okay, what's best for the residents of the NWT, whether, aside from whether politics or corporate challenges, etc. But then there's not much. There's only, we got, like I said, a finite clientele here. And how do we best serve that clientele should come out as the very number one initiative for any utility in the Northwest Territories.
I see Mr. Bolu. Do you have any follow-up, Mr. Norn?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jan. Thank you for that response. Doing through all my research here, I want to, and like a lot of our colleagues are working on, we're trying to make it easier for our people to get employment. We're trying to make it easier for our businesses to, get those contracts. And I've been working with some of our staff too as well, with some of the procurement stuff and doing, cross-jurisdictional, research. Let's see what's being done around the North America. And I think one of the things we looked at is the AA program in Alaska, and that was some interesting stuff, because you know what, it's good to see other places, like looking at ways to help their businesses thrive, not just survive, not just keeping their nose up. They're actually doing things that help them to help them create more employment, help them create, stimulate their economies in their areas, and I'm hoping we could get more of that here, because, just in the last year alone, we're still seeing just like outside of the territory, you're getting Americans still working here, for work that can be done by ourselves, and without saying too many negative things, it does upset me, even when you get people from outside the territory, and their companies, and like for a lot of work that we can do, and we're still seeing our people, not working, and this is very upsetting. I think we can still move towards that, and I think it all comes down to a lot of making some really realistic, firm policy changes, and I think we're moving in that direction. I think we're starting to see that, and I think that's going to be a big key from our side of things, and then with that, and giving our business sector firm tools where they can survive, and then just let them be like let free enterprise do their thing, let the businesses do their thing, and let them give them an environment, as you mentioned, where they can put food on the table, put roofs over people's, their own house, people, where we could have a good, strong economy, because, we have, and I mentioned this before, we have a large honeypot of resources here. We're a G7 nation, I mentioned before, like in the House. We have some of the we're one of the most resource-rich areas, like, on the planet. I really firmly believe that. And if if people like the Floor Freight want our product, I think we want to make sure that we get ours, no matter what. I'm not just saying Indigenous business, but also the business side as well. So I'll leave it at that, and yeah, I was really happy. I'm really happy that you were here today and sit with us and share your ideas and some of your thoughts with us. Mr. Shaw.
Merci for those positive comments, Mr. Norn. I think we've extended our time for this session here. I'd like to thank Mr. Bolio for joining us today, and if you have any last remarks or closing comments, I'll give you that opportunity. Merci.
Yeah, a couple of brief short ones. Just to close off with Stephen's comments in terms of capacity. I wanted to leave a thought in your heads. Northland Utilities has so far worked with 3 generations of Batsinas. You know that? Since Frank Batsina started working with them in the late 50s, 60s, my great uncle Isidore Sangres worked for them for many, many years till he retired. So that there's a lot of people that worked in NTPC and Northland Utilities, and recently, we had one young man, Jordan Cleary, who's we trained him. He worked for us. He left to work at the mines. He went to work for another technical company, and then now he's back. So sometimes you lose people you train, but sometimes they come back home. So I think those are the things you want to hear in the north, and then they're role models for other kids in the territory and in the communities. And in terms of leaving those dollars in the north, Dedon Cho, Tlicho, and Dennis O'Fline and all the other different corporations, whether it'll be in Inuvik or Fort Simpson or Fort Smith or Hay River, the dollars that they generate is staying here in the north, and they employ in the north. Yes, some of them employ southern people, but it's the expertise that they require to do the job based on the contracts that they get. So yes, I think the model is there. We just got to grow it. We got to grow it and make that sustainable. It'll need a little bit of tweaking moving forward, but it's there. So Indigenous business are starting to set the tone in terms of how they're doing it. The territorial government's got to set the tone in terms of creating that opportunity in the economic environment. And we got to work together to meet those challenges for our residents. With that, thank you.
Merci, Mr. Beaulieu. Thank you very much for appearing before us today in the committee. Now we will take a short break, get ready for our next presenter on call. Merci.